Additional funding for the Maddie Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the state capitol and the Maddie Institute, it's the Maddie Report with Executive Director of the Maddie Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. California is big. Some have even described it as a nation state. Every 2 years, California's nonpartisan legislative analyst office compiles a comprehensive look at the state of California in a publication called CalFacts. Carolyn Chu with the LAO is here to discuss the most recent findings. Welcome to the Maddie Report.
Thank you.
So let's start with California's economy. There are 17 million jobs in California. Who does what where?
So CalFacts is our best attempt to try to summarize a very diverse and large state.
This is amazing. This pamphlet is what, 52 pages, and it covers about 40 million people.
Correct.
That's pretty amazing that you summarize it like that. But okay, so talk about the economy.
Sure. So California really has a number of regional economies, with certain areas of the state having higher concentrations of certain types of jobs. So for instance, as many people know, the Bay Area has a high concentration of technology jobs and professional services like lawyers. The greater LA region is a hub for goods, so there are a lot of warehousing and transportation jobs. Unsurprisingly, Sacramento has a high proportion of the state's workforce.
Right, and of course in the Central Valley it's agriculture.
Correct.
So, okay. It's what, the 6th largest economy in the world or something like that?
5th or 6th, depending on where currencies are trading.
It's right up there. Okay, so what about income levels? How do top incomes in California compare to top incomes in the U.S.? And do they vary by, I assume they vary by region and occupation?
That's correct. California, on average, has higher incomes than the rest of the United States. There is broad regional variation and variation within regions across the income spectrum. Overall incomes are highest in areas like the Bay Area. But as an example for the income distribution, if you look at San Diego, the top 10% of earners earn about $300,000 a year, where the median household earns about $66,000 a year.
Yeah, I was doing a deep dive into your numbers, and even a broader extreme, took a look at the San Joaquin Valley. You're in the top 10% if you make $216,000. You got to make almost double that to be in the top 10% in the Bay Area, $404,000. And then just I thought was really interesting, looking at the average salary in California versus the average salary in the United States. It's $64,000 in California, $55,000 in the United States, so a bit higher. No surprise there. Let's talk about the aging of California's workforce. What are the numbers there? I'm assuming you got a baby boom generation that's kind of moving through.
That's right. In the 90s, California had a high proportion of prime working age folks who are now close or about to enter retirement age. As a result, California's working population is going to grow slowly over the next couple of years. Looking ahead, California's workforce actually may not grow at all because women had fewer children over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, and again, looking at the numbers are 2.5 on average in the 90s. Now it's 1.8.
That's
so
right.
It's dropping, and you know, who's going to be replacing? You think about that. A lot of companies and organizations are losing some of their senior talent. Who's going to replace them? And that's a question. So let's talk about the other end of the continuum, from income poverty. What are the levels of the working poor in California, those making less than, say, $15 an hour?
So most of those making less than $15 an hour in California are in the service industry, folks like custodians or those in the retail sector. Overall, about 12% of Californians earn somewhere between $11 and $12 an hour, but that was before the most recent increase to the minimum wage in January. So those levels might be a little bit higher now.
You know, it's interesting. Again, your numbers, it's just amazing what's in this booklet. I'm picking out all these interesting numbers. What I found in there was 5.2 million, 13%, in California are below the federal poverty line. That's a pretty high number.
Yes.
And a larger portion of those are children.
Yes.
19% are children. 15% of those without a college degree. By the way, only 5% with a college degree. So you want to stay out of poverty, get a college degree. And even some seniors, 10% of seniors are in poverty. So that's interesting. And by the way, about a third of all workers, according to your report, make less than $15 an hour. So some interesting things going on. Really economic disparity in California, it seems like. So a major driver of poverty is housing. Right?
Yes.
Of course, on the other hand, if you own your home, that's probably a major source of your assets, of your wealth. So it seems to be driving the poverty rate. How do home prices compare in California to the U.S.? And what about renters? How does it affect renters in California?
Sure. So to your point, actually, if you take into account things like the cost of housing in California, 19% of Californians live in poverty using that supplemental measure.
Right. There's two different measures of poverty. That's right. When you're at housing, it's even higher.
That's right. So on average, a California home costs about 2.5 times the cost of a home on average in the rest of the United States. So it's considerably higher. Renters also, rent is about 50% higher in California than the rest of the nation. So a 2-bedroom in California on average is about $1,800 a month. That of course varies across the state. In the Bay Area, it's about $3,000 a month. And in Fresno, it's about $1,000.
It's interesting. I did a little math, and I said, okay, if you're making $15 an hour, that means you're bringing home $2,550 a month. So that means you're using about 3/4 of your income on housing if you're renting a place. That really seems to capture it. Pretty significant. Okay, well, up next, we're going to take another look at California state and local finances. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddie Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Hepler with the Maddie Institute. I'm talking with Carolyn Chu with the California's Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office that every 2 years publishes something called CalFacts. I'm going to show the folks. There you go. Great little pamphlet that provides key information about the state. So what about state and local finances in California? Let's talk about some of the main sources of revenue for the state and local governments. Now, you report that in 2016-17, taxes in California raised a total of about $210 billion, nearly equal to 10% of the economy, and that state government collected about 2/3 of those taxes. Can you explain kind of the key sources of state and local government revenue?
Sure. So for the state, the largest single source of tax revenue is the personal income tax. For this year, we estimate the personal income tax will raise about $100 billion. After that, it's the sales tax at a little over $25 billion, and then the corporation tax, which is somewhere around $12 to $14 billion. For local governments, the largest source of tax revenue is the property tax, followed usually by the sales tax.
And there's a cap on property tax because of Prop 13.
That's correct.
So it seems like that's one of the reasons why the state seems to have a little more control, because he who has the money makes the rules, who has the gold makes the ruals, and since Prop 13, it seems like the power shifted toward the state a little bit.
In some respects, yes.
In some respects, yeah, particularly education. Personal income tax. It overtook sales tax then as the main source of state revenue. But why are you always hear they're volatile. Personal income taxes are volatile. Why is that so?
There are two primary reasons the personal income tax is volatile. The first is what is considered personal income for the purposes of tax. California, unlike the federal government, includes capital gains as part of personal income. And those typically are more volatile year to year.
So it's kind of like stock market, you get a gain in the stock market.
That's right.
And so when the stock market's doing well, California's flush with money.
That's correct.
Of course, when the stock market isn't, which also kind of creates a conundrum, right? When the stock market's not doing well and the economy is not doing well, that's right the time when the state needs the money. And that's right the time when it's not getting it.
That's right. That's right.
That's a problem.
So the second reason the personal income tax is volatile is because of the progressive rate structure. California taxes those who make more at higher rates. And over the past few decades, higher income groups have seen larger gains in their income. Yeah,
there was I think we've had Dan Walters on from time to time. I think he cited something called, don't tax me, tax the guy behind the tree. People like taxes as long as they're not directed at them. So given the volatility with the revenue structure in California, voters passed Prop 2 back in 2014 that essentially set aside some revenue in good economic years to take care of what happens in those bad economic years. Can you explain how that works and how the budget reserve has grown over time?
Yes, so Proposition 2 takes a share of general fund revenues, so from the personal income tax, sales tax, and corporation tax, in addition to a portion of capital gains revenues when the economy is particularly robust. That happens according to a complicated set of formulas. But then essentially what happens is that amount of money is split in half to pay down state debts and then put the rest into the reserves. Since 2014, state reserves have grown from about $2 billion to almost $14 billion.
Wow, that's quite a large jump. I think, and I was reading again your report, there's so much in here, it was 3.7%. The reserve was 3.7% in 2014-15. It's jumped to 16.8% in fiscal year 18-19. So it's almost more than a 4 times jump in what you're, I wouldn't want to call it the rainy day fund because I'm confused. There's several funds, but
yes,
the reserve.
Overall reserves.
Overall reserves, yes. Okay. So let's take a look then. We'll shift from revenues to expenses, that side of the ledger. What are the major expenses in the state budget?
The two largest categories of spending for the general fund budget are K-12 education, which is about 40% of the budget, and Medi-Cal, the state's health insurance program for low-income individuals.
It seems like though a lot of people think that it's the prisons. It isn't, is it?
No.
They're way down the list.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a surprise. In fact, you add higher education to the education, but it's over 50% of
That's
the education.
correct, yeah.
So education is the big driver, it seems like, for expenses, but on health and human services as well. So let's talk about state and local governments and their financial relationship. It's kind of unique. How has it changed over the years?
Well, as you mentioned, Proposition 13 fundamentally changed local governments in that their property taxes were capped. Consequently, their revenues were capped. Subsequently, the state and counties in particular had a series of changes in responsibility for programs and fiscal responsibility for those programs that really changed the landscape of how services are delivered in California.
Yeah, and it seems like counties have a lot to do with health and human services, and they're getting a lot of that money from state or federal government.
That's correct.
Yeah, it's a huge part of their budget. So let's talk about local governments. You've got city, county, and people forget special districts. They're out there too. What functions do they do, and where do they get their money to do it?
So all local governments, counties, cities, and special districts provide a variety of municipal services like water, sewer, parks, and other public works. Counties also provide a variety of county-wide services like elections or property assessment. And then, as you already talked about, counties provide a lot of human service and health services.
You've also got those special districts, and
That's
there's
right.
a ton of those, and it's like, God, they cover a lot of cemeteries. I mean,
Yes,
they
yes.
cover a lot of different things as well.
Yes.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so many special districts are single service special districts where their primary responsibility is for a single thing like water or parks or cemeteries in some cases.
Right. Okay, well, thanks for providing that overview of state and local finances. Up next, we're going to talk a little more about education. As you said, the largest expenditure in the state budget. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddie Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddie Institute. We're talking with Carolyn Chu of the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office. California Public Education, from kindergarten through college, largest in the country, and it's also the biggest expense, as we said, of the state budget. So where does the money come from for K-12 education, and how does spending on education compare historically over time? How do we look compared to other states?
Sure. So overall spending on K-12 and community colleges comes from the state general fund and property taxes. Overall, statewide, about 2/3 from the general fund and 1/3 is from local property taxes. Currently, for K-12 education, state spending is at an all-time high at about $11,500 per student. When you include federal funding, you get to about $17,000 per student.
Does that, so that's the average, right? So that's
Statewide.
Okay, all right. So there's also some, when you talk about state funding for education, there's some additional money provided for certain students, local control funding formula. So there's base funding.
That's right.
And then in addition to that, there's funding for things like English as a second language, the percentage that you have of students who are dealing with that issue. So what's the base funding and how much additional funding is this local control funding formula providing?
So the local control funding formula, or LCFF, provides base rates, as you mentioned, depending on what grade a student is in, and then these additional monies for low-income and English learner students. The base rates range from about $8,000 for a kindergarten through third grader to $9,000 in high school. For English learner and low-income students, it depends on how many of these students are enrolled in a district.
Right.
For districts with low concentrations of these students, they receive about $400 per student, but with districts with very high concentrations of these students, they get about $3,500 a student.
Yeah, it used to be they had something called categorical imperatives. That was money specifically targeted for certain programs. They got rid of that.
That's right.
And they instead used this LCFF to, and then the school districts decide how to spend that money.
That's right. The funding is flexible, and school districts can spend it as they determine.
Okay, so let's talk about the key metrics for education. Meeting state standards, and how do we compare nationally? Is there an achievement gap going on here?
So less than 50% of California students meet state standards in reading and math. When it comes to a national comparison, California students overall score a little below average nationally. Looking within California, the achievement gap is most pronounced for Black and Latino students, who score on average below their white and Asian peers. Low-income students also score lower on average than their peers.
And so we have more of those in California than the other states in the nation, and so therefore it affects how well they're doing on exams. And one of the reasons why they have the local control funding formula to provide more funding to help these students. Okay, let's talk about public universities. How popular are they? How many students are there? What's the demographic breakdown of typical UC, CSU community college students?
So the community college system with over 100 campuses is by far the largest place for higher education in California. About 60% of undergraduates in California are enrolled at the community college system.
60%?
That's right.
That's a huge number.
Statewide.
Well, it's a good deal. I mean, it's relatively inexpensive. In fact, very inexpensive.
That's right. That's right.
It's essentially free.
About 14% of undergraduates are at the California State University System, CSU, and 8% are at UC. Overall, the demographic breakdown at the community college system and the CSU system reflect the state's demographics.
So it's similar, so you don't see a big change from going K-12 in terms of performance when they get to college, that those achievement gaps still exist to some extent.
The lowest graduation rates are for Black and Latino students.
Okay, so let's talk about the funding and costs of higher education. Where's the money coming from and what is it being spent on?
So for the community college system, the vast majority, almost all of their core funding comes from either the state or local property taxes.
Because they're treated a little differently. Some people, they say K-12, but when you talk about education funding, it's really K-14.
That's right. For the CSU system, about 70% of their core funding comes from the state, and for the University of California, it's about 60%.
Yeah, and one thing I've noticed is that the tuition at UCs and CSUs have gone up pretty dramatically.
Yes.
And I want to say almost doubled. It's like since the 90s or something, it's gone up quite a bit. So more is expected of the students or their families who are paying for their education.
Yes, for those students on financial aid, typically most of their costs are covered by the state.
So let me ask you this. There's been reports that say that California's going to need about 1 million more college graduates in the next 10 years if it's going to stay competitive economically. So have graduation rates improved?
Graduation rates have been improving at CSU. Right now they're about 60%. That has been improving over the last couple of decades. The graduation rates at UC are higher at about 80%, but only about half of community college students graduate.
Yeah, so when they get into community college, that's where I guess where you would do really well if you can get those students to continue on to either getting a degree or certificate or moving on to college, four-year college. Well, thanks for that summary on California education, kindergarten through college, a lot to cover. Up next, we're going to address a myriad of other important state issues, things like dealing with poverty, crime, health, transportation, and the environment. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Carolyn Chu of California's nonpartisan legislative analyst office that publishes Cal Facts, a compendium of facts about the state. Let's show the audience. This is your book that you want to get. Anyway, we talked about education as the biggest expense in the state budget, but there are a lot of other programs the state's involved with dealing with poverty, health, natural resources, transportation, et cetera. Let's talk about some of those programs. So first, let's talk about the major human service programs like SSI, CalFresh, otherwise known as food stamps, CalWorks, welfare, et cetera. What can you tell us about those programs?
Sure. So California has a wide range of programs, human services programs to help folks. And these are just a few snapshots. So California has about 4 million families or individuals enrolled in CalFresh, the food assistance program. Mm-hmm. There are 1.3 million people enrolled in SSI SSP, which provides cash assistance to the elderly who are disabled.
And the blind.
And the blind,
yeah,
yes.
So it's
yes.
protecting those people we want to protect in society.
Yeah,
okay.
And then California has about 500,000 people enrolled in the in-home supportive services program, which helps disabled and elderly individuals with activities of daily living so that they can stay in their homes.
And increasingly that's important to
yes.
elderly people. I had elderly parents and they didn't want to go to a senior facility. They want to stay at home.
Yeah, and it's California's fastest growing human services program.
And it's going to continue with the baby boom generation. I think you're going to see that continue. Yeah. Okay, what can you tell us about health-related issues, things like health insurance, healthcare spending, mental health, things like that?
So about half of Californians have their health insurance through a private provider. Most of those people get health insurance through their employer. 40% of Californians receive health insurance through a public provider, so that's predominantly through Medi-Cal, the state's low-income health insurance program, or Medicare, the federal program for healthcare for...
that expanded a lot with the ACA.
The Medi-Cal did, yes,
right.
Expanded considerably. And then 10% of Californians do not have comprehensive coverage. Overall, annual spending on healthcare is about $400 billion a year. Wow. The largest payer are healthcare plans who make payments on behalf of their enrollees, and the largest category of spending is on hospitals.
Yeah, it's very expensive. Hospital stays are incredibly expensive. Okay, so let's talk about crime and incarceration in California. What can you tell us about that?
Crime in California has been declining over the last 30 years, which is similar to the rest of the nation. Over the last 10 years, California's state prison population also has been declining, largely in response to policy changes that the state has made.
Because the courts were saying you've got too many people in prisons. It's larger. It's beyond capacity.
That's right.
Basically. So
California realigned, moved a number of incarcerated individuals from state prisons to county jails.
Which, by the way, it's just as a layperson, a term I learned that there's a difference between a jail and a prison. Prison is state, jail is county.
That is right.
Okay.
That is right.
All right, so let's talk about, we're covering a lot of ground here. California's environment, things like air, water, natural resources, wildfires. What can you tell us about that?
So in recent years, California has seen some of the largest and most destructive wildfires since the early 1900s. Last year, California spent about $2 million on response and recovery efforts to wildfires, in addition to federal monies, which are significant in these cases. In terms of water, as many people know, most of the rain falls in the northern part of the state, and California has a very extensive network of canals to move that water around.
The problem is the people live in the south, right?
That's
the
correct.
Water demands are in the south.
That's correct, and in CalFax we have some maps that show the different canals that the state has. In terms of the air pollution...
Before you jump into air,
sure.
I mentioned something about those canals. With subsidence, this over-reliance on groundwater pumping, some of those canals are cracking or sinking, and so now you can't convey the water as efficiently as you used to be able to.
That's right.
That's another problem. But so there we go. So what about air?
Oh, air. The pollution burden, so the relative levels of pollution across the state vary. Some of the areas with heavier pollution burdens or just more pollution are the San Joaquin Valley and certain regions of LA County.
Yeah, we're very well aware of that. It's the basin, right? And then it heats up and all kinds of problems. Let's talk about transportation. Voters just approved a 12-cent sales gas tax. What can you tell us about transportation infrastructure in California?
So the recent increase in the gas tax was to pay for maintenance of California's transportation infrastructure. Much of California's transportation infrastructure is in need of repairs. About half of state highways are in what's called fair condition and need some amount of repairs. And the majority of transportation...
That means, by the way, when you're saying that, that means the other half are in not such great repair.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And then the transportation infrastructure, much of it needs to be replaced, as most of it is at midlife, the end of its useful life, or actually past its useful life. Things like city buses, rail cars, that sort of thing.
Okay, so transportation and other infrastructure products, they're funded typically with bonds. Those payments come from the state's general fund, generally. What does the debt service of the state look like?
So debt service, bond payments for the state comprises about 4% of the state general fund annually, a little bit more than that, which is actually a little bit lower than historically. In some years we were above 5%.
Yeah, people don't understand, I think, sometimes when they look at a bond, it's actually going to cost you twice as much when you get done paying interest. I usually just look at the number and just double it, and that's going to be the cost of the taxpayer.
Typically, that's right.
Putting the stuff on the credit card, as it were. All right.
That's right.
Well, I want to thank Carolyn Chu from the California's Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office for covering a lot of ground today. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can log on to our website at maddieinstitute.com. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.